Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Eating Disorder Hope and Addiction Hope Google Hangouts. We're so glad that you could join us today. I'm Crystal Kargas for Eating Disorder Hope and Addiction Hope, and we have the privilege of being joined by Dr. Jerry Law, who just has incredible contributions to both the addiction and eating disorder communities. So welcome, Dr. Law. We're so grateful that you could join us today, and we appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Crystal. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So we're talking about something very interesting and very important today, which is interventions for eating disorders and addictions. And Dr. Law, you're actually a board-certified intervention professional, which is very interesting. Can you maybe just start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and what brought you into this field?
Oh, I'd be delighted, Crystal. Sometimes I call it an eclectic background, code word for really odd. I spent, 20 plus years in the corporate world in senior management positions, and towards the end of that time had gone back to school to complete my master's and doctorate degrees in counseling. And so I am a professional counselor. I'm a master certified drug, alcohol, and addictions counselor. And as you indicated, I'm a board certified interventionist. And it's been my incredible privilege over the last dozen years or so to work with hundreds of families throughout North America who have a loved one that needs some help. And they're either in denial about that need or just unwilling to do anything about it. And through this process based on love, care, and concern, it's all about presenting the truth to that individual and giving them the opportunity to reach out and accept the help that they need, whether they're struggling with chemical dependency or an eating disorder, compulsive gambling, compulsive sexual behaviors, any kind of a disordered behavior that really leads to the need for intensive help.
Thank you for sharing. That's just wonderful, because as I'm sure you know, that so many people who are struggling with either eating disorders or addictive diseases, I think the hardest step is just accepting what they're dealing with and asking for help. So it's amazing that people like you exist and are able to help families with interventions like that.
Well, it's hard for me to imagine doing anything else at this point in my life. It's rewarding. I consider it a calling, and it's just a great thing to do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And that kind of leads me to my next question. The eating disorder and addiction communities are, they're very mentally intensive, I guess, if you could say that, that they're very complex psychiatric illnesses that deal with very different factors. So what keeps you in this field, day after day? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but what's your inspiration? What keeps you going?
It's simple, Crystal. I'm in recovery, and it's part of my own recovery, which is giving back and helping people. There's nothing quite as rewarding as that moment when a person says, yes, I'll accept the help that is needed, and now we can get them into some kind of a treatment program. But my work at that point is just beginning, because now I have the privilege of continuing to work with the family while their loved one is in treatment and get them into their own type of recovery, whether it's from codependency or whatever else has been going on, through a lot of education and encouraging them to become active in an actual recovery program for themselves, because the whole family is impacted by these diseases, not just the individual.
Exactly. It's such a good point. And just kind of delving into the whole topic of interventions, oftentimes I think it is family members and friends that are aware that something is just not right with their loved one. So how would they know if their loved one is appropriate for an intervention? What are some things that you kind of recommend or look for?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, Crystal. When people initially reach out to me, if they're in an area where I can meet with them personally, I do. Or otherwise, we do a webinar. And part of, or a large part of that initial meeting is an assessment. Is an intervention clinically appropriate given the situation that you're feeling? I certainly have had some situations where people have reached out to me, and frankly, what they're wanting me to do is ambush their loved one and drag them off somewhere. I don't do that. That's called kidnapping.
Right.
So it's about helping the family understand where their loved one is in regards to need for help. So let me take just a moment, and I'll visually, or I'll present something that I do to my clients when they first reach out to me. I usually do this on a whiteboard, but I'll just kind of do it in the air here.
Okay.
I want you to imagine a horizontal line running from left to right. And at the far left end of that line, above the line, we write the word use, U-S-E. Okay, this is where someone is when they first begin using mood-altering substances or engaging in mood-altering behaviors. If it's an eating disorder, that might be binging and purging. It might be restricting. If it's a chemical issue, obviously it would be the use of those chemicals. Now, the good news is the vast majority of people never travel any further down that line. They live their whole life there. In the world of chemical dependency recovery, we call these people normies. These are normal people. These are people that can go to the ball game and have a hot dog and a beer and go home, and that's all there is to it. Or these are people who may occasionally involve themselves in some kind of behavior that might not be the best, but it's really not life-changing. Now, other people move down that line until they reach a point where it's no longer use, now it's abuse. And that's different. At the abuse level, well, that's when the bad things start to happen. Right. There may be a DUI. There may be organ damage. There may be inability to attend school, the loss of a job, the disruption of family relationships. The good news is most people who reach that point find those negative consequences to be uncomfortable enough that they make a decision on their own to turn around and come back and live the rest of their life back here. Others, for any number of reasons, continue down that spectrum until they reach an area, and I like to use the word dependency, whether we're talking about chemicals or behaviors.
Right.
And that's different. At the dependency level, it's a whole new ballgame. People who have reached this end of the spectrum, as I say, it's a new world for them, and we recognize it by identifying particular symptoms and behaviors that we can tie directly to their use of whatever it is they do. And how we talk to those people is different than how we would talk to someone at the abuse or use end of the spectrum. I'll give you 3 or 4 examples that I routinely give my families when I'm talking about how to recognize if your loved one is down at that dependency end. One is we just simply use the word loss of control. It doesn't mean the person's lost control of every aspect of their life. It means they've lost control over their use of whatever it is. They don't have that control mechanism any longer. Secondly, we see a preoccupation. It's pretty much what's going on in this person's mind all the time.
Right.
Get it, use it, have it, hide it, steal it, whatever it takes. A third thing we see here is continued use despite the consequences. You know, at the abuse level, I talked about the consequences driving change. Down here, the consequences become an acceptable part of the deal. This is the person who just uses over and over or performs this behavior over and over despite the negative consequences. I have a good acquaintance who has been in recovery from chemical dependency for many, many, many years, over 30 years. But back in the day when that individual was active in using, his second DUI arrest happened while driving home from a court appearance for his first DUI.
Oh, wow.
Now that's not normal. That's not normal drinking. That's a different person. And one more, down at this end of the spectrum, we tend to see people have a distorted perception about what's going on. Their loved ones, their friends recognize it, but they don't. And often that manifests in some form of denial. Now, denial can be, well, I don't have a problem, or denial can be, okay, I might have a problem, but I can manage it because I'm special. Or it can be the victim, poor me, woe is me, I'm hopeless, I'm helpless. So there's a list of symptoms and behaviors that we look for that help us identify where a person is on that spectrum. Because when they're down here at this end, you have a very different person on your hands, and how you approach them needs to take into consideration where they are on that spectrum. So long answer to a short question.
No, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you for that explanation. I think it's helpful to hear the different categorizations like you were explaining. So thank you for that, Dr. Law.
My pleasure.
And that kind of moves us into the actual intervention itself.
Yes.
You know, I know it comes to my mind, the show Intervention. I think that's what most people think of because that's all we see or hear if you've never actually been involved in it yourself. But can you maybe describe for us or help us understand what steps are involved for a successful intervention?
Absolutely. The two most important keys for a successful intervention, defined as the person goes to treatment. There's two ways of defining this, and I'll get to the other one in a moment. But the two most important keys are, number one, having the right people involved, and number two is adequate preparation. Now, the word adequate is a little bit subjective. It may take more time in some cases than others. But the reality is most interventions, the actual moment of sitting down with the individual, may only take an hour or two. But on the front end, long before we've ever sat down with that person, I'm going to spend upwards of 15 hours, sometimes 20 hours with that family, preparing them, training them, educating them. Sometimes I find myself performing mini interventions with the family members along the way. You know, I may have 8 people on the intervention team. Well, I've got 2 that are ready to do this, and I've got 2 that really just want to drag their loved one off, and I've got 4 that are on various points in between. I've got to create a team. I've got to educate them. I'm going to spend a great deal of time on psychoeducation of the addiction process, what it is, what it isn't. I'm going to train them on how we're going to say what we're going to say to their loved one at the intervention. There's nothing sloppy or random about it. You know, as you know, sometimes the TV shows make it look like, well, the person just walked in this room one day and ta-da, everyone was there. That is not the way it works. I'm spending hours and hours and hours with these family members, getting them ready, preparing them, and so forth. Then we do a comprehensive rehearsal. We rehearse the intervention just as though their loved one was there. And I have everyone read the script that they have created, which I train them based on a very rigid outline on how those letters should be written. I listen to what they have to say. Occasionally I coach them on changing a word here or there, or adding some things that need to be added. We rehearse overcoming objections. If the individual says no, I'm going to ask a very important 2-word question, which is, why not? Well, we want to know in advance as many of those why nots as we can, so that we can determine the best way to overcome objections, not argue. We don't ever argue. This is about choices and consequences. And the individual gets to make a choice. They can choose to accept the help that's being offered, which comes with wonderful consequences, or they can choose to continue in the mess and in that dysfunction, but that has consequences too. The rest of the family is making choices. They're not going to enable any longer. They're not going to ignore any longer. They're not going to walk around the issue, nor are they going to be manipulated by their loved one any longer. So whether the person goes to treatment or not, it's a change for the family system. And that's the second definition of a successful intervention. If I've done my job right, I will have given this family a whole new set of tools for working with and dealing with this issue, regardless of their loved one's choice. So it's a lot of planning and preparation.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think, like you said, it's not something that we see, that all that behind the scenes work, which is so important to making it successful.
Well, no one would watch 12 hours of preparation.
Yeah, exactly. They just want to show, you know, the main highlight, but that's all the important work that you're discussing.
Exactly.
And I kind of have a question to piggyback off of that. How do you know which family members to involve? You said you've had up to 8, and I'm sure you've had more, but how many family members should be involved in an intervention? Is it usually just intermediate family, or how do you kind of assess and determine that?
Again, a fabulous question. When I first meet with people, I tell them this is the criteria. We are looking for people that your loved one either, not all of these, but any of these, either loves or respects or admires or wouldn't want to disappoint. Now, certainly that pool of individuals is immediate family, but it reaches beyond that. Friends, neighbors, coaches, teachers, people from a person's past. I've seen a number of situations where the loved one is so used to manipulating the family that they just continue to do so. But we bring in a friend, a neighbor, a coach, someone from church, whatever, and it changes the dynamic because the family member knows they can't manipulate them, or the loved one knows. And quite often, when that person says, will you go? I want you to. They're so concerned about disappointing that person, they'll say yes and go.
Wow, that's really interesting.
I typically start out by telling families we're looking for 8 to 10 people. Don't always get that many. Really don't want too many more. This isn't about a gang, but when you're up against a disease as deadly as addiction, you're already outnumbered when you've only got 3 or 4.
That's really interesting. And you did mention that you're giving the person a choice. Ultimately, it's their choice and what they want to decide. So what does happen in a scenario where someone chooses not to go to treatment despite the significant intervention that has been attempted?
Yeah. Well, the good news is over 80% of the cases, the individual goes to treatment that day.
Wow.
But there are some who don't, and I'll give you a recent example. I did an intervention for a family, and the loved one was a woman who said, no, I'm not going anywhere. And so we overcame the objections that she had, and she still decided she wasn't going to go. So basically it was, okay, there's the door. See you later.
Aww.
And she walked out the door. Now, for an additional 3 weeks, she was on a daily basis calling her family and trying to negotiate an easier, softer way, trying to negotiate something under her terms. And so I had prepared the family for that and coached them and said, now, when she calls you, before you respond, call me. And I'm going to coach you through those moments, because the message we must send to your loved one is, going forward, number 1, we love you. And number 2, the only thing we can and will support is recovery. And in this case, this is what we will support. It was going into a residential treatment program. It took 3 weeks.
Wow.
But finally, this individual went to treatment and has successfully completed treatment and is doing well.
That's amazing.
But if the family dynamic hadn't changed, if the family had continued to rescue and enable, I'm sure she'd still be out there using.
Wow, that's a really powerful story. And I think having someone like you, like to actually coach the families through completion, I think that's so important. And I wanted to ask that too, when you do have an individual that consents to treatment, how much longer do you continue working with that family following their decision to proceed?
Yeah, I will always work with the family as long as their loved one is in formal treatment, whether that's residential or an outpatient program. I will continue to work with the family. Now, some families take advantage of that more than others. I've had some other families who have said, you know, our loved one has completed treatment, they're doing great, but we'd still like to do regular check-ins with you.
Wow.
Which I do. And we can do it by phone, by email, by Skype, in person. You know, that's the cool thing about all this technology is they can be anywhere on the planet.
Right.
And we can have these kinds of meetings. So I'm always staying involved while their loved one is in treatment. And then it's kind of up to the family beyond that point.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And how, let's say we have if some of our viewers who are watching this are concerned about a loved one and just really on the fence about what to do and are possibly considering intervention, do you have any encouragement for these families? You know, I think the hard thing about these diseases is that they're very delicate issues. They're hard to approach, and the sufferer is usually in denial, but I think sometimes families are in denial too, because it's really hard to accept that your loved one is sick and going through this. So any encouragement there?
Absolutely. Quite frankly, often the family is more difficult than the loved one. Because one of those, you know, the loved one is an individual, and that person and I connect right away.
Right.
But all these family members who are on different pages. You know, what's most important is recognizing this is a disease. This is not about your loved one being bad or wrong or immoral or evil or wicked. Now, they may be doing all kinds of immoral or wicked behaviors.
Right.
But that's not what this is about. At its core, these diseases are neurological. You know, we embrace the biopsychosocial spiritual definition of these diseases, and it's got all of these components. And so it's important to recognize that if you've got a loved one who is in this at that end of the spectrum again, get some help. Good news is help is abundantly available. There are people like me all over the country. There are treatment centers of every ilk. Residential, outpatient, intensive outpatient, PHP, treatment programs are readily available. So if there's someone watching who has a loved one that they think needs some help, call me. I'm happy to provide a complimentary consultation to talk it through, and whether it turns into an intervention or not, I'm delighted to be of service in any way that I can. The good news is recovery is wonderful.
Yeah,
I've never, ever enjoyed life as much as I do in recovery.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you shared that, Dr. Law. Thank you. And I think it's good for people to know that you're not alone, and it may feel like you're the only person on the planet dealing with this vicious disease. But like you said, there's so much help out there and support. So
you bet. Well, we often say these are the only diseases known to man that tell their victims they don't have it. But they also tell the family members, well, your loved one can't have that. Your loved one can't have an eating disorder. I mean, they eat all the time. Or your loved one can't have an addiction. My gosh, they get up and go to work every day. It's not the point.
So I just was kind of concluding everything. And to end, did you have any encouragement for anyone who might be watching and who themselves is struggling with addiction or eating disorders?
Absolutely. Reach out for help. The great paradox of recovery is that victory comes through surrender, which of course doesn't sound like it makes much sense, but it really does. Victory comes through surrender. Surrender to the help that you need. Reach out. Find someone who's been through what you're going through, whether that's in a 12-step program, whether that's a treatment program, a counselor. Reach out and know that help is abundantly available.
Thank you so much, Dr. Law. Fantastic encouragement. And again, it was just such a privilege to have you with us for our Google Hangout today on interventions for addictions and eating disorders. So thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you, Crystal, for having me.
Of course. And then can you briefly mention where we could find out more information about you? I know you mentioned that your website is www.interventionaz.com, but anywhere else that we might be able to find you?
Well, sure. Our primary website, as you just mentioned, is interventionaz.com. You can also do a Google search of my name, and I'm going to pop up on multiple sites and locations. Or feel free to call me. A toll-free number is 866-491-1554. Be delighted to talk to anyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again. We appreciate your expertise, and thank you for the wonderful contributions that you're making in our community. It's really inspiring to see that.
Thank you, and thank you for all that you do, Crystal. You're important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And for our viewers, we would also encourage you to check out our websites at www.eatingdisorderhope.com and also addictionhope.com for plenty of resources. We also have our upcoming Google Hangouts and Twitter chats listed as well. So we'll hope you'll continue to join us. Thank you again. And Dr. Law, thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.